This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 20, The Fire of Liberty. Charles Carroll was making quick, anxious strides across the floorboards of the president's mansion as Dolly Madison oversaw the tedious removal of the large painting of George Washington from the dining hall wall. She fingered the collar of her dress, watching the painfully slow progress of their servants, Paul Jennings and Thomas McGaw, as they unscrewed it from the wall. The impatient looks from Mr. Carroll were a poignant reminder to her of their perilous circumstances. Finally, she said, "It's taking too long. Break the frame and remove the canvas." She quickly finished penning the last words of a letter to her sister, and after allowing the ink to dry, she slipped it into an envelope and rose to her feet. "We haven't much time," Mr. Carroll once again reminded her. Dolly nodded, but she was not about to be ushered out without securing the things that she believed to be the most important. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving everything to be destroyed by the British's fury, and as her husband was absent, it was up to her to make these decisions. Where was James at this moment? For her own sake, she feared for her husband's safety, but for the country's sake, she feared for the safety of their president. James had left to inspect troops at Bladensburg, and he hadn't yet returned. But in anticipation of this very situation, they'd earlier made plans to escape Washington. She just hadn't realized that she would be making her way alone. She could only hope that she would find her husband at their designated meeting place. When the servants finally finished, and Dolly placed the portrait into the hands of the two New Yorkers, Jacob Barker and Robert de Peyster, for safekeeping, she stopped them as they turned to leave. "Remember," she said, "it is not to be allowed into the hands of the enemy, as their capture would enable them to make a great flourish. Destroy it before you allow that to happen." She began gathering up the most significant of the cabinet papers, along with the household silverware, china, books, and other items. But most of her personal belongings would have to be left behind. There simply wasn't room, and she felt compelled to prioritize American relics over her own possessions. Around 3 o'clock, a man came galloping up on his horse, furiously waving his hat. It was James Smith, a free black man who had accompanied her husband to the Bladensburg battlefield. He cried, "Clear out! General Armstrong has ordered a retreat!" Dolly gathered up her skirts and prepared to flee. As she rode away with Charles Carroll, watching her home and the Capitol building disappear from view, the words that she had just written to her sister ring again through her mind. "And now, my dear sister, I must leave this house, or the retreating army will make me a prisoner in it by filling up the road I am directed to take. When I shall write to you again, or where I shall be tomorrow, I cannot tell." Never had she been in a situation where her own future was so unknown, nor the fate of her beloved country. Ever since I was a child, I've been fascinated by storms. I love to watch the clouds gathering and see the heavens pour down rain while lightning streaks across the sky. There's just something so beautiful and majestic about it. And I didn't realize until I was older that the reason I feel this way is because in the weather, I see the power of God. Honestly, it amazes me that we as humans ever become arrogant or complacent. I mean, a simple sickness is enough to lay us out flat. And anyone who's been caught in a natural disaster or even just seen the aftermath of it will tell you what a humbling experience it truly is. You'll never understand just how helpless and weak you really are than when you see a tornado forming or feel the ground beneath you begin to shake. There's no mistaking in that moment just who is in charge. And you do not want to find yourself fighting against the God of heaven. The War of 1812, sometimes referred to as the Second War of Independence, is something most people know little to nothing about. We sometimes think that after the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, that our independence was secured, But the truth is that America found itself again embroiled in yet another conflict with Britain just 29 years later. You see, America and France became allies after the French helped America to gain its independence. But the other surrounding European countries saw France as a failed experiment, and they wanted to reinstate a French monarch. This launched the Napoleonic Wars. Britain, along with other countries like Austria and Russia, combined together to fight against Napoleon's expansion. Even as the British were engaged in this conflict with France, they were still feeling the sting of being beaten by those no-account patriots across the ocean. And to add insult to injury, America was trading most of its goods with France, which did not sit well with the British. They started seizing American vessels and subjecting the goods to taxes whether or not they were intended for England. And worse, they were capturing American sailors and forcing them into slavery in the British Navy. After 10,000 Americans were press-ganged on the seas, President Madison declared war. Now, there were mixed feelings about this among the Americans, and the truth was that America was still very much an infant nation. We didn't have the resources to take on Britain before, and we still didn't now. We'd only gained our independence in the first place because of some serious godly intervention. But one thing that America did have in its favor going into the War of 1812 was that Britain was fighting two wars, one with France and the other with America. But when Napoleon surrendered to the Russians and was exiled, the Napoleonic Wars for a time ended, and Britain had a lot of their resources freed up. Now they could focus entirely on squashing those pesky patriots, and America entered one of the darkest hours it had ever seen. The British launched an attack on the capital, cutting their way right through to the heart of the city, and burned the Capitol building, the President's Mansion, and the National Library to the ground. First Lady Dolly Madison barely escaped before the British burst through the doors, ransacking the place and setting it ablaze. She managed to save the full-length painting of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, and State Department clerk Stephen Pleasanton gathered many other national documents, including the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which were safely stored in a home in Loudoun County, Virginia, where they escaped the destruction. British Captain Harry Smith later wrote in his autobiography, "We were horrified at the order to burn the elegant houses of Parliament and the President's house." Smith went on to say that he would never forget, quote, "the destructive majesty of the flames as the torches were applied to the beds, curtains, etc." The flames were so massive that some reports said that they could be seen in Baltimore some 35 miles to the north. The fire threatened to spread and consume all of Washington, but interestingly, the flames were doused when a huge thunderstorm rolled in. Captain Smith recalled it as, quote, "a regular hurricane. It did not last more than 20 minutes, but it was accompanied by a deluge of rain and such a gale that it blew down all our piles of arms and blew the drums out of camp. I never witnessed such a scene as I saw for a few minutes. We learned that even in the river, sheltered by the woods, several of our ships at anchor had been cast on their beam ends." In an article written by Patrick Brown, he explains the significance of this storm in these words. "The driving rain put out most of the fires threatening the city. Perhaps more important, the invading British were so battered and demoralized. The storm played a large role in the decision to cut short the occupation of Washington." Brown goes on to say, "The storm was so fierce that it tore buildings apart, literally lifting them off their foundations. The winds uprooted trees and knocked men to the ground. A number of houses collapsed, killing the British soldiers taking shelter therein. One British officer reported seeing cannons lifted off the ground and thrown through the air. Redcoats out on the streets of Washington, trying to enforce a curfew, were forced to lie prostrate in the mud." Based on the first-hand accounts, weather historians generally agree that the storm that struck Washington on August 25, 1814, sparked one or more tornadoes. I can't possibly imagine being one of these soldiers, completely exposed with no choice but to cling to Mother Earth in the midst of a tornado. As the storm began to subside, one of the British officers in command of the invasion emerged from his shelter and said to one of the inhabitants of Washington, "Great God, madam, is this the kind of storm to which you are accustomed in this infernal country?" She responded, "No, sir. This is a special interposition of Providence to drive our enemies from the city." In the article I just quoted, the author Patrick Brown admits, quote, "I have no opinion on Providence, but there can be no doubt that the tornado that struck Washington that day did more to save the capital than the United States Army ever did." The fires were largely extinguished, and the British limped back to their ships. Now continue to pay attention to the weather, because that is going to be a significant factor going forward. But as all of this chaos was happening and the British moved on to their next target, a quieter endeavor was taking place. A humanitarian effort made by a young lawyer aboard a cartel ship. War was such a terrible thing. It was God who gave life, and God alone who should determine when it was taken. Why couldn't men find peaceful solutions to their conflict? Why must fighting be a natural result of disagreement? These questions pulsated through Frank's mind as he watched the rhythmic movement of the waves, the wind blowing across the Potomac and lifting to ruffle his curly brown hair. When President Madison had first declared war against Britain, Frank's feelings had been highly mixed. Not for a lack of patriotism. His own father had fought alongside George Washington, and Frank had spent much of his adult life working in the nation's capital. But as a God-fearing man, he had hoped to see the conflict upon the seas resolved without bloodshed. A hope which had been to no avail. War had brought every uncertainty and fear imaginable. He thought of his wife and children who'd fled Georgetown in light of the British's attack on Washington. That had been a dark day indeed. Frank felt a hand briefly grasp his shoulder and turned to see John Skinner standing beside him. John gave him an encouraging, if somewhat tense, smile. At 26, John was younger than Frank's 34 years, but he was, like Frank, a lawyer, and as overseer of British prisoner negotiations, he'd already had his fair share of experience in matters such as this. A voice suddenly rang out above their heads, announcing that a British ship had been spotted. Frank snatched up his spyglass and pressed it to his eye. "How many can you count?" John yelled up to the lookout. The man peered through the field glasses from his position. "Could be 30 or 40, sir. They're coming this way." "Finally," Frank murmured. It had been 3 long days since they departed Boston Harbor in search of the British fleet. Immediately the flag of truce was drawn up so as to be in plain view of the British's lookouts. After they'd come close enough to communicate with the British vessel, a rowboat was sent to bring them across. As they made their way to the towering British ship, a mix of relief and anxiety washed over Frank. They'd found the ship, but that was hardly the most difficult part of this journey. On the contrary, they were embarking on the most perilous part of this mission. As they climbed aboard, Frank found the main deck bustling with activity. Red uniforms swirled all around them as men scurried about their duties. They were clearly preparing for something, for no one seemed without a task. They were approached by 2 high-ranking officers. They introduced themselves as none other than Admiral George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross, looking refreshed and recouped since their attack on the Capitol. When Frank and John explained that they'd come to discuss a prisoner release, they were politely invited by the British officers to join them for an early dinner. They were acting friendly enough right now, but Frank feared that their congeniality would disappear once they heard their request. Surely enough, as they sat down to dinner and began asking about the potential of releasing their prisoner, Dr. William Beans, both men's countenances instantly darkened. Cockburn especially spoke of the doctor in harsh terms, his fists clenching as he said, "I am planning on hanging the doctor to the yard arm of this vessel." He took a swig of his drink, adding, "The man is a varmint and a pig." A less experienced man might have lost his composure, but Frank hadn't gained his standing as one of the most reputable lawyers in America by losing his head. As the Admiral launched into a plethora of angry sentiments regarding his prisoner, Frank leaned back in his chair, his mind calculating the right approach. Any misstep might prove to have grave consequences. Frank was disappointed to not find the British of more honorable characters. With some exceptions, they appeared to be illiberal, vulgar, and decidedly against all things American. Though, he acknowledged, he may have formed a higher opinion of them under different circumstances. But their treatment of Dr. Beans did not reflect well on their characters. Frank had known the good doctor for years. William Beans had been a surgeon during the Revolution. After the British had burned the capital, they'd broken off and raided a number of farms in Maryland, one of which being that of Dr. Beans. The old doctor had quickly organized a group of local men to go after the renegade British troops, and even imprisoned several soldiers. But in retaliation, Dr. Beans had been ousted from his bed at midnight and taken prisoner. After the family had made several failed attempts to plead for his release, they'd finally called upon Frank to undertake the dangerous task. He'd had to get approval from President Madison himself to embark on the mission. Frank just hoped that he'd made the right choice. By doing so, he knew that he'd plunged himself as well as John into the midst of their enemies. Frank leaned forward as he and John both tried to explain how Dr. William Beans was a civilian non-combatant and should never have been imprisoned in the first place. Frank further added his witness of the doctor's excellent and moral character. This argument did not seem to carry much weight with their British hosts. Then from his jacket, John produced the letters given them by General John Mason. They were accounts written by British prisoners of war, recounting the humanity and kindness with which they had been treated by the Americans during their imprisonments. Cockburn and Ross took turns reading the letters, and slowly their countenances began to soften. And as the dinner wound down, General Ross took John and Frank aside, saying, "Dr. Beans deserved much more punishment than he has received, but I feel myself bound to make a return for the kindness which has been shown to my wounded officers. And upon that ground, and that ground only, I will release him." When his old friend was brought up from below deck, Frank felt sickened by the sight of him. It was clear that he'd not had a change of clothes from the time that he was seized, and had endured cruel treatment and conditions that were harsh and humiliating. But he was alive. Frank could not wait to get him back into the care of his family. But as they went to depart, they were stopped. "I'm sorry, gentlemen," the Englishman said. "For the time being, you will sail with us." Upon inquiring why they were being detained, the officer answered, "Sir, we are about to attack Baltimore." Dread shot like a bolt of lightning through Frank. "After discussing so freely as we have done in your presence our purposes and plans," the soldier continued, "you could hardly expect us to let you go on shore now in advance of us. You will have to remain with us until all is over, when I promise there will be no further delay." Shortly thereafter, Frank, John, and Dr. Beans found themselves on their own boat, being towed behind a 50-foot-long British craft up the Chesapeake Bay. They entered the Patapsco River, and Frank spotted the jutting peninsula on which sat the fort named after one of George Washington's Secretaries of War, Fort McHenry. Baltimore lay just beyond it, a couple of miles up the river. Above the star-shaped fort waved a massive American flag, swaying in the breeze. They dropped anchor about 8 miles away from shore, far enough to be out of range. The attack might have been imminent, but it was not immediate. The Americans spent the next 3 days as hostages aboard their own ship, watching the preparations of their enemies. Then, on the morning of September 13th, the British bombshells let loose. The hissing rockets catapulted into the sky, along with glittering, fiery shells, threatening destruction as they fell. Explosions shook the air. It was a terrible sound. All that day, the onslaught continued. Frank watched from the safety of the ship, gripping the railing until his knuckles were white, as he remembered a comment that Admiral Cockburn had made at dinner. He'd said that Baltimore needed to be burned. Now the words chilled Frank to the bone. He had no doubt that should the city be overtaken, there would be plunder involved, and he feared for the women and children. The hours ticked by, and the onslaught did not cease. How much more of this could the fort take? Even as his companions went below deck, Frank continued to pace the ship's decking, praying for God's deliverance and pondering the fate of his country. Losing Baltimore would be a devastating blow, if not a lethal stab to America. He kept his spyglass fixed on the waving stars and stripes, knowing that as long as that flag remained, so did America. Finally, the darkness of night, combined with the smoke from the cannons, obscured his vision too much to see whether or not the flag was still waving above the fort. None of them slept. How could they? The very fate of their country was hanging in the balance. Dr. Beans observed the attack with a haunted expression. The pained look of a man subjected to watch the peril of a nation he'd already fought once to free. They heard the pounding of rain just before the wind began picking up in ferocity. Soon they found themselves engulfed in a tremendous storm. The boat rocked violently with the tossing of the waves. Flashes of lightning mixed with the fire of the rockets, peals of thunder with the screaming of cannon fire. Time crawled by as the men helplessly listened to the destruction. At 2 a.m. came an absolute roar of fire, more intense than anything they'd heard thus far. The British had unleashed hell on the battered fort. The three men listened in agony, wishing that there was some communication between the other ships so they might know what was happening. Finally, around 3 a.m., the firing ceased, replacing the sounds of war with a deafening silence. They weren't sure what it meant. Had the British won, or had they finally given up? There was no way of knowing without communication with the other ships. The minutes and hours dragged by as they waited in painful anticipation the rising of the sun to apprise them of the battle's outcome. Slowly, a dim glow began to bring with it the coming of the dawn. Just after 6, Frank again peered into his spyglass, aiming it toward the fort. He spotted a flag hanging limply from the pole, but was unable to tell whose it was. He held his breath, pleading with heaven that somehow it might prove to be the American flag. Then, a slight breeze stirred the fabric, and he caught a glimpse of those familiar stars and stripes. "It's still there," he announced breathlessly as his eyes burned with tears. The men let out exclamations of joy, embracing each other as their hearts swelled with gratitude to God for their deliverance. Against all odds, the fort had stood. Amid their exultations, Frank quietly pulled an envelope from his pocket, scribbling down several lines of poetry that had begun forming in his mind through the night. "Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." Francis Scott Key, or Frank to family and friends, had a front row seat to the fateful battle at Fort McHenry in 1814. After the destruction at the Capitol, the British expected to find Baltimore yet another easy target. In Washington, they'd only burned federal buildings. The purpose had been to make a statement. But they had different plans in mind for the staunchly patriotic, anti-British Baltimore, no less than its entire destruction. In all of America, Baltimore was arguably the most adamant in its patriotic leanings. But it truly earned the British's ire by its working of ships called Baltimore clippers. These were highly maneuverable cargo vessels that were responsible for sinking or seizing more than 500 British ships, which amounted to about a $16 million loss for Britain. That did not go over well with the world's greatest naval power. In fact, the British press referred to Baltimore as a nest of pirates. But the citizens of Baltimore had seen the flames from the capital, and they feared that they would be next. Francis Scott Key's aunt, Elizabeth Maynadier, wrote to his mother from Annapolis saying, "Every moment we expect to hear the dreadful roar of the cannon. The Lord in his infinite mercy look down upon us and avert the miseries that are impending over our heads." Sunday, September 11th, as many were attending church, 3 shots rang out, alerting the city of the approach of the British. The Wilkes Street minister told his congregation, "My brethren and friends, the alarm guns have just fired. The British are approaching and commending you to God and the word of his grace. I pronounce the benediction, and may the God of battles accompany you." The British command decided to implement a 2-part attack, one a land invasion and the other a massive sea bombardment. While Francis Scott Key was trying to find the British fleet to arrange Dr. Bean's release, thousands of Americans were flocking together to defend Baltimore. Major General Robert Ross, who led the land invasion, vowed that he would, quote, "sup in Baltimore tonight or in hell." He was urging his men forward against the first American lines when he was shot down by an American rifleman. The death of their leader, accompanied by the realization that the Americans were constantly getting reinforcements, led them to pull back. It also didn't help that when they camped that night, a terrible storm blew in. One British officer reported, "The rain fell in torrents. The roaring of the thunder and the tremendous flashing of lightning was truly awful." On the sea invasion side, British vessels formed a semicircle around Fort McHenry. 5 were British bomb vessels with the terrifying names of Devastation, Terror, Volcano, Etna, and Meteor, along with 11 frigates and the rocket ship under Admiral Cockburn's charge, prepared to unleash destruction on the fort. The commanding officer at Fort McHenry, Major George Armistead, had commissioned a massive flag, 30 feet by 42 feet, big enough that the British would not be able to miss it. The flag was so big that it weighed more than 50 pounds and required 11 men to raise it to the top of its 90-foot pole. When the storm blew in, they raised up the smaller, more durable storm flag, and after their victory, once again hoisted their larger banner, the banner that Francis Scott Key would see from a distance. In Baltimore, men, women, and children climbed to the roof of their homes to watch the awful spectacle of exploding shells. Judge Joseph Hopper Nicholson wrote that at Fort McHenry they were, quote, "like pigeons tied by the legs to be shot at," because the British had far better equipment with much longer range. So great was their advantage that the British felt entirely confident in their impending victory. Robert J. Barrett, a teenage British midshipman, later wrote, "On board, the advanced ships had little doubt that the British ensign would soon proudly wave in triumph over the embattled fortress." The British ships fired at least 1,500 mortars, cannonballs, and rockets in 24 hours. George Armistead said, quote, "A large portion burst over us, throwing their fragments among us and threatening destruction. Many passed over, and about 400 fell within the works." An article from the Bill of Rights Institute adds this great detail. Quote, "Everyone was terrified and waiting to be blown to smithereens when a shell crashed through the roof of the magazine where 300 barrels of gunpowder were stored, but miraculously, the gunpowder did not explode." Another miracle was the massive storm that blew in, ruining gunpowder and fuses, and it forced the British to draw closer to the fort and within reach of the Americans' ammo. British Admiral Cochrane had boasted to his men that they'd have the fort leveled in a couple of hours. But after fighting all day and through the night, the fort still stood, and its inhabitants had no intention of surrendering. Incredibly, through all of this, only 4 Americans at Fort McHenry died, and just 24 were wounded during the British onslaught. Francis Scott Key's pen captured the emotions surrounding this event. He called the poem that he wrote Defense of Fort McHenry. It was later renamed The Star-Spangled Banner, and would officially become our national anthem in 1931. But who was Francis Scott Key? At best, people remember him as the author of our national anthem. At worst, they don't even know who he is. But I don't think you can fully appreciate the Star-Spangled Banner until you come to know a little about its author. Frank watched the passing streets of his hometown from the seat of the carriage, pleasant nostalgia washing over him. Sitting with him was Maryland Congressman Francis Thomas, and his longtime friend and now brother-in-law, Roger B. Taney. Roger was a gawky fellow, and it was a bit of a wonder how he'd managed to win Frank's lovely sister Anne's heart. Roger had also gone into law, and recently become engaged in politics, as had Frank himself. It was for the purpose of supporting Taney that Frank had joined this particular event, and he was amazed at the turnout. Over 90 horsemen had made up the cavalcade riding with them. At 2:30, with the hot August sun beating down, 500 attendees gathered in the Frederick Courthouse yard for a public dinner. They toasted to Frank, Thomas, and Roger, and in return, each man stood to make a speech. When it was Frank's turn, he got to his feet, looking around and feeling a wonderful sense of being home. He tried to express how much he loved the annual visits that he made to his childhood home in Frederick, saying, "Never even from boyhood have I come within the view of these mountains without having my warmest affections awakened at the sight." He swallowed, thinking through what he wanted to say next. In the 20 years that had transpired since he'd stood on that boat watching the bombardment of Fort McHenry, he'd never spoken about it publicly. But the poem had taken the country by storm. Frank smiled, telling the crowd how gratifying it was to know that by following the impulses of his own feelings, he had awakened theirs. The song, he said, came from the heart and made its way to the hearts of men whose devotion to their country and the great cause of freedom I know so well. He paused, feeling the emotions of that fateful night come back with great force. I saw the flag of my country waving over a city, the strength and pride of my native state. A city devoted to plunder and desolation by its assailants. I witnessed the preparation for its assaults. I saw the array of its enemies as they advanced to the attack. I heard the sound of battle. The noise of the conflict fell upon my listening ear, and told me that the brave and the free had met the invaders. Frank went on to describe the sacrifices made by the men who answered the call to defend their country. Then, with great feeling, concluded his thoughts on the experience. The clouds of war, the stars of that banner still shone in my view, and I saw the discomforted hosts of its assailants driven back in ignominy to their ships. Then, in that hour of deliverance and joyful triumph, my heart spoke, "Does not such a country, and such defenders of their country, deserve a song?" With it came an inspiration not to be resisted. Let the praise then, if any be due, be given not to me, who only did what I could not help doing, not to the writer, but to the inspirers of the song. When Frank had finished his speech, he sat back down, thinking on the extraordinary deliverance of God. He had no doubt that it was an act of interposition that had carried them through that fateful night, and would carry them through the future. Francis Scott Key was only 4 years old when the Treaty of Paris was signed in September of 1783. So he was raised in the first generation to ever enjoy independence. For pretty much as long as he could remember, America had been a free nation. But it's pretty safe to say that he would have grown up hearing tales from the Revolution. His own father had been a captain during the war, and was said to have fought under the direction of the Marquis de Lafayette during the siege of Yorktown, the battle which led to the surrender of the British Army and the end of the war. Francis Scott Key's family was wealthy, but perhaps the greatest inheritance that he gained from his parents was a love for God and an uprightness of character. His mother was an extraordinarily pious woman, who taught her children directly from the Bible. Virtually every person who met Francis Scott Key remarked on his religious nature. His correspondences were replete with scripture references. He wrote, "Read your Bibles every morning and every evening. Never neglect private prayers both morning and evening. And throughout the day, strive to think of God often, and breathe a sincere supplication to Him for all things." Later in his life, Key wrote to his children saying, "Go regularly to church, plainly dressed, and behave reverently. Do everything for God's sake, and consider yourself always in His service." Throughout his life, Francis Scott Key frequently led religious services and visited the sick. There was a time when he was younger that he seriously considered going into the ministry. This especially makes sense when you understand that Francis Scott Key had a gift. It was a way with words. He had the ability to move people and to change their perspectives. He also had a great love for poetry, and wrote it regularly ever since he was a child. Many of the poems that he wrote dealt with religious themes. But he didn't become a minister. He decided to become a lawyer. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he'd become one of the most renowned lawyers in Washington, D.C. One courtroom observer wrote, "From the moment he arose, the crowd was brought back from the doors and every adjoining part of the house, drawn by his peculiar celebrity as an orator." Now here's something that's really interesting. Having been raised in Maryland, Key saw throughout his early life many of the northern states abolish slavery, because now that they'd broken away from Britain, they could actually do that. Maryland was an in-between state, and while it didn't abolish slavery outright, it was heavily influenced by the surrounding states, and ended up putting in place laws that would allow slaves to petition for their own freedom. So as Key continued gaining great success in his career, he frequently offered free legal advice to impoverished African Americans in Washington, and often represented them in court to fight for their freedom. And he did that pro bono. He is directly responsible for the emancipation of over 100 slaves, and gained a reputation as one of the most active advocates of liberty in the D.C. District Court. Reverend John T. Brooke, who was a personal friend of Francis Scott Key's, wrote, "If ever man was a true friend to the African race, that man was Francis Scott Key." Throughout his own region of the country, he was proverbially the colored man's friend. He was their standing gratuitous advocate in courts of justice, pressing their rights to the extent of the law, and ready to brave odium or even personal danger on their behalf. One of my favorite stories about Francis Scott Key happened when a riot was taking place in Washington, D.C. A group of racist men were attacking the homes and businesses of some free African Americans. They were specifically targeting one African American who was in jail, having been accused of a crime, and as a mob gathered to come and try and take this individual, Francis Scott Key walked out in front of the jail and told the men that what they were doing was wrong, and that he would not allow them to go through with it. Talk about courage. In many ways, Francis Scott Key led the fight for abolition at the Capitol. Being a talented lawyer, he fought for abolition in the way that he knew how, which was in the courts. Now, interestingly, Key was raised on a large estate that was run by enslaved people. So people might say, well, this is a strange contradiction of character. But Key ended up freeing several of his own slaves. The only ones, according to his personal writing, that he did not free were the ones who were elderly and hadn't done work for him for many years, that would be without means of taking care of themselves or even somewhere to stay if he turned them out. So basically, he kept them so he could pay for them, as well as provide legal protection for them and prevent the possibility of their being put back into slavery. But it's not his abolitionist efforts that the world remembers Francis Scott Key for. It's the words that he wrote in September of 1814 that forever immortalized him. I'm always deeply moved when I hear the Star-Spangled Banner. I'm especially touched by the fourth verse that is hardly ever sung. It reads, "Oh, thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just. And this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." There is controversy today over what the flag represents. But if an abolitionist like Francis Scott Key, who knew all too well the flaws of his nation, could look on that banner with reverence and see the hand of God, so can we. There's this revisionist history now that's trying to say that America was built on racist ideas. But America did not introduce slavery into the world. Not even close. Slavery, unfortunately, is something that has existed from the earliest parts of history. America was the first to set the precedent of emancipation. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, didn't Britain actually beat America to emancipation? Now, that is true in a sense. England outlawed slavery in 1834, and America didn't send out the Emancipation Proclamation until 1863. But the northern states of America outlawed slavery well before Britain ever did. In fact, in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson included a scathing and lengthy paragraph against the British monarchy for, guess what, instituting slavery. Here's a little snippet from it. "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither." This is why it always upsets me so much when people say that the founders just did not care about the African American people. The only reason this paragraph did not make it into the final draft is because two states did not approve, Georgia and South Carolina. And the signers knew that if there was any division among the states, the British would prey on that. They had to be united. But after America gained its independence, many of the northern states immediately sought to end slavery within their borders. And by 1804, all of the northern states had abolished slavery. Why? What made the northern states different? It was because of the Christian influence in that part of the country. Those states had been founded by the Puritans, who believed in the equality of man. This was unheard of in other parts of the world. America set the precedent. Some people won't stand for the national anthem or the flag because they view it as a symbol of slavery and oppression. On the contrary, it is a symbol of the land of the free and the home of the brave. Francis Scott Key said, "My countrymen, we hold a rich deposit in trust for ourselves and for all our brethren of mankind. It is the fire of liberty. If it becomes extinguished, our darkened land will cast a mournful shadow over the nations. If it lives, its blaze will enlighten and gladden the whole earth." I will be the first to say that America is flawed. and God has had to call us to repentance many a time. But it has a history of miracles and is a story of continuous deliverance on the condition that in God we trust. This is a heaven-rescued land. I hope that when we sing our national anthem, we let those inspired words spark that fire of liberty that will ignite our faith.